Well, in a good way, allow me to introduce myself the way I've been taught back home, where I come from, in that traditional way. Good morning, everybody. My Christian name is Clayton Thomas Muller, and it's a pleasure and an honor, and I'm humbled to be here in the beautiful territory of the, I'm going to slaughter the pronunciation of this, but the Tesuque? The Tesuque Pueblo. I'd first and foremost just like to say that I come from the Cree Nation, or in my language, what we call the Inuit, the people. And our territory spans from northern Quebec all the way to northeastern British Columbia and Canada, and all the way down into Montana. And so we've got a big nation spread out pretty far over Canada, and in a good way, I'd just like to say that when I go home, I will let them know how well fed I was when I came here to this land, and how gracious my hosts have been. And so I appreciate that. I'd also just like to acknowledge in a good way that the tribe has allowed us to be here today during their ceremonies, and I just want to be reverent to that and humble to that as well. And just acknowledge those ceremonies that are being conducted here in this sacred land today in a good way. And so, I've been invited to come and talk a bit about the work that I do, but before I do that, let me preface by just talking a bit about where I come from. My community is called Pukatawegan, and Pukatawegan in our language, the proper pronunciation is Pukatawegan, and it means the place we go to fish, the fishing place. And it's really funny, actually, because the Indian agents, when they were rounding up our people like cattle and creating the Indian Reserve System in Canada, they were really lazy. And at one point, I guess, they come down the Churchill River, which is the river my people have hunted and trapped on and fished on, for millennia. And they came down during the summertime because it's easy to access, I guess. And they saw our summer fish camp, and they said, oh, that must be where they live. But we were nomadic. We would leave according to the season and go to the proper place where we could subsist and practice our traditional lifestyle and culture in a way that made sense to our circle of life that we called home, our biodiversity. And so in the summer, we stayed where our reserve is now based, where it's been for the last 100 or so years. And it's really funny, though, because in the winter, it's really darn cold. It's not the best winter location because it's up on a great big hill on the mouth of the Churchill River on Pukatawegan Lake. And there's a great wind that comes off that lake during the winter time. And so it's really cold, like minus 60. And it's really hard to put those nets under the ice when you got minus 60-degree weather blowing at your face. So I come from Puck, and both my mother and father come from Pukatawegan, but our family comes throughout all that territory, which is right on the border of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, at about the 56th parallel. How many of you know where Grand Forks, North Dakota is? Right on. Well, if you drive straight north 16 hours, you'll get to where I come from. Anyway, for much of my life, I'm an urban Indian. I grew up like many of the native people, I'm sure, in this territory. I've grown up in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. I grew up in a city called Winnipeg, which is on the border of North Dakota and Manitoba. And, with that experience came, a lot of confusion, I think, about the current socioeconomic state and the dispossession that my people have experienced from our traditional culture and our way of life and our sacred connection to Mother Earth. And I think with that, came a lot of frustration and anger, and my youth was filled with a lot of involvement in gang activity and just trying to basically subsist in an urban jungle. Trying to find a way to feed myself and to take care of my own in a concrete environment. And it wasn't until I almost turned 20, my 19th year, that through a program for inner city Native youth that I was able to attend my first Sundance ceremony and have my eyes and my heart and my spirit opened up to another perspective, an old perspective about our people and our strength and our sacred connection to Mother Earth. And it was the first time that attending that Sundance that I seen our Native people gathered as a community, working together, collectively to heal one another, to feed one another. Well, not the dancers, but everybody else that helps out. Dancers don't eat or drink for 4 days, but anyway, that's another thing. But it was the first time in my life that I was able to see how strong our communities are when they work together, and how much strength there is in the teaching of why we braid our sweetgrass, our most sacred of medicines. Because through colonial policies, assimilation policies, both here, in the United States with the Indian termination policies and the Indian Wars, and in Canada with the British style of assimilation that they use there to generate a legacy of dependency that to this day my people are still dealing with. I've come to learn that basically, the reason that they implemented things like Indian residential schools, the reason that they took away our men's ability and role to go out onto the land and hunt, and the reason they took away our mothers' roles to gather medicines and small animals and to take care of our children, when they removed our children forcefully to take them to these assimilation schools. They did that because of the fact that our strength lies in our collective knowledge. Our strength lies in our ability to practice our social systems, to speak our languages. And all of these things are sophisticated systems of sustainability that our nations have developed over millennia of observing the sacredness of our circle of life of which Creator put us. And our very language, our oral histories, are vessels of knowledge. Each word in my Cree language has profound and significant meaning and is a vessel for our collective knowledge. And in oral histories, for those of you that don't know, the languages are such an important thing, because within those stories and those songs that we hear, there are profound and significant teachings about how we, with our sacred responsibility to speak for those that cannot speak for themselves, and I'm talking about the ones with the 4 legs, the ones that fly, the ones that crawl under the earth as in the insect kingdom, the ones that swim in the ocean and the rivers and lakes and streams. We have a sacred responsibility to speak for them as caretakers of Mother Earth. And all of those teachings about how to coexist peacefully as part of that sacred circle of life, the teachings of how to do that exist in our culture, our ceremonial practices, our social systems, how we raise our young, the way that we harvest and collect our medicines, and the animals that we subsist off. These are highly sophisticated systems of earth sciences that our people have practiced for time immemorial. And this is the reason why the colonizers, really, I think, first and foremost attacked our family structure and tried to take away the roles of each, very important member within our family structure. Because the braid, the sweetgrass, and you'll see some of our Native men where I'm from, we have long braids. I used to have long braids, but I cut them recently because my father he passed, and that's what we do. But, we braid our hair because each of those 3 strands in the braid represents the strength with the mother, the father, and that firstborn child. That's what that braid represents, and it's unbreakable. And so, I just wanted to put that out to you because, in my family, I was the first one born that didn't go to Indian residential school. I went to public school, and was part of that generation in the early 80s that got integrated into public school. And, I got pretty tough scrapping, because there was no supports and a lot of racism. But it was an interesting thing because, all my mother and her sisters and brothers and, and all of our relations before that all went through that horrible, experience of going through the Catholic Church-run residential schools. And this was a process to dehumanize our people and to further separate them from these highly sophisticated and complex systems that I've been talking about. And so for me, I was blessed that my mother was able to take me up north during the summers. As I told you, I grew up in the city. But as a small child, I spent my summers up north with my great-grandparents. And even though they were staunch Roman Catholics, very, very, very religious Catholic people, to this day I have yet to meet more traditional Indian people than my great-grandparents. Because, people would come from miles and miles around to see them, to get medicines, to get doctored, to get healing in that traditional Indian practice that they would do. From miles, they would bring fish bigger than my grandfather as offerings. They would bring an arm of a bear. You know, we eat bears where I'm from. I know that's very sacred down here, though. Sorry. You know, they would bring all kinds of different things as offerings, you know, for those healings. And you know, my grandfather, I remember him putting things in, you know, berries or whatever, snuff, into the river when we would go and get the fish out of the nets. And I remember my great-grandfather taking me on walks as a little boy to go get the snares on his trap line to get the rabbits for our dinner in the evening. And I remember specifically one time when he gave us little boys, he gave us crap. He said, "Hey, get the heck out of there. Come over here for a second. I want to talk to you." And we all came up and we're like, "What's going on?" And he said, "You see this trail?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "I've been walking on this trail for many, many years. And I don't go out and just run around just any place." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And he said, "Because there's medicine there. And they have a sacred spirit in the life. And you have to be respectful of those things. So you have to walk on the trail. You know, so we respect these things." And he took an area about as big as this table. And he showed us like 10 different medicines and told us what they were for. And it was quite an amazing and profound experience to me because it's never left me, you know. It's never ever left me. And so that's a little bit about me, you know. I think to fast forward to now, you know, I got a PowerPoint that I brought today that's going to talk a bit about the work that I do through the organization called the Indigenous Environmental Network. And then I got a few things that I want to talk to you about from the heart. And that's going to be kind of the content of what I'm going to share with you all today. However, I wanted to open up first, given that it's the morning. I know you did a Sundance ceremony already, but where I come from, it's good to sing an eagle song in the morning, just in a good way. So I'll contribute this song. I recognize the face over there. I'll contribute a song to all of you to open up in a good way, and then I'll get started to talk a little bit more about the work that I do fighting against the fossil fuel economy and fighting against, you know, huge transnational oil and gas and energy corporations that have been targeting our native homelands to turn our communities into batteries for unsustainable cities and their energy consumption. So, what I come to talk about today is a little bit about the work that I've been involved in for a number of years. You know, I told you a bit about my youth and the experiences of my youth and some of the challenges and the beauty and just all the complexities of growing up as a young Native person in the world that we live in today. You know, and a part of that confusion that I talked about earlier was also about my own homeland that I was gifted to be able to travel to during the summers, to spend time with my great-grandparents. And there, on our trap line, there's a lake, a shallow body of water with nothing alive in it. It's just this lake with a clay bottom. And the really interesting thing about it is we used to always swim in it, and beside it, how you get down to the beach was this huge cliff, this massive erosion, okay? Because it's all sand up north, It's all the leftovers from the receding glaciers, and it's all eskers and, small little trees and that sort of thing. And anyhow, this lake that I grew up swimming in was part of a vast hydroplane of the hydro reservoirs that were created through the damming of the Churchill River and other rivers in our territory, so that Manitoba Hydro, a crown corporation run by the government, could generate cheap electricity for Manitoba's urban centers, and furthermore sell cheap electricity to the U.S. market. Okay, and so for us, many years later, I come to think and understand just how much we sacrificed so that people living in cities could turn on their lights, have illumination, so that they could cook their, craft dinner and all these things, have transportation, ride the light rail or whatever, There was a huge sacrifice that we gave, for that to happen. A sacrifice in terms of lost traditional hunting territories, of vast, volumes of medicines that grew in the area that is now submerged underwater. In terms of our very ancestors and where we buried them. Many of my ancestors today are under vast hydro reservoirs, And so for me, I won't go into the details of everything, but I was born into this movement. I was born into the fight for environmental justice. This isn't something that I just chose to do. It chose me. And that's why I've committed my life to fighting for justice, fighting to create space for communities to come together to dialogue about the systems of oppression that have been created here in America and in Canada, to keep wealth concentrated in the pockets of the rich and to keep the poor people down, okay? And why I also fight to create space and dialogue in the movement and in different places for us to talk about how we as human beings can reevaluate that which has been severed, the relationship that we have to the sacredness of Mother Earth. Because what we're doing here at this conference today, and what many of you do, I'm sure, in your work, is that's what it's really about, is we're reevaluating our relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth. Because the hyper-individualism of American capitalism has really separated us from the strength that we have in being with our families and with our communities, and also being a part of that great circle of life that, for some reason in the last 150 years of this psychotic Western scientific industrial experiment that's being conducted, we've been ripped away from that sacred connection, that circle of life that we've been a part of for millennia. And so the Indigenous Environmental Network, for a number of years, has been working on a variety of issues. We work on toxics and environmental health and developing the linkages between human and ecological health. These two concepts are inextricably linked, kind of like energy production and climate change. We also work on mining and other, extractive industries issues. Energy and climate justice are our flagship campaigns. We also have a Water is Life campaign, which, is kind of cross-cutting through all our energy, biodiversity, and different work that we do on toxics. Water is always a key theme because of its sacredness, and because of, water is life. Biodiversity, sustainable development, and youth leadership are all key components to the work that the Indigenous Environmental Network does. And IEN, was started in 1991. It was founded in response to a call by Dene elders in the Navajo Nation who met in Kikotsmobi at the first Protecting Mother Earth conference. Not Kikotsmobi, forgive me, it's a red place. What's it called again? I just said Kikotsmobi to one of the guests in the audience, so forgive me. That's in Hopi land. It's right by Flagstaff. What the heck's it called there? They got the volcanoes there. Huh? Dilcon, thank you. Donna knows. Dilcon, Arizona is where we were founded. And basically, you know, in the early 90s, there was an attempt by the government as a form of economic development to site over 200 medical and toxic waste incinerators in Indian country. And, you know, the elders, you know, called upon the younger people to stand up against this psychotic proposal and to put a stop to it. And so IEN was founded in 1991, and since then, you know, we've grown into a network of about 250 Indigenous communities, organizations, and individuals, and our sole purpose for existence is to fight against, you know, those that are threatening the sacredness of Mother Earth through toxic contamination and corporate exploitation. And we're fighting to preserve and protect the rights of our Indigenous peoples to practice our traditional livelihoods and to practice our traditional spiritual practice and beliefs and that sacred relationship that I keep bringing up to all of you. So global well-being, Pukatawegan is the word in my language that we talk about. You know, bottom line, there must be a convergence in confronting the global triple crisis that is emerging. Catastrophic climate chaos, which basically summed up is the increase of human-induced climate change affecting all regions of the Earth. Climate chaos and global warming threaten the loss of much of the world's most productive lands, physical upheavals in many places from storms and rising waters, massive dislocations, and desertification of many agricultural lands. An economic and social tragedy for well into the future, with problems especially severe for the poorest nations and peoples. One only has to remember Hurricane Katrina and Rita to know exactly what that point is talking about. The second problem in this triple threat that I'm talking about is the end of the era of cheap energy, peak oil and gas. And this is the imminent end of the era of cheap energy, bringing dramatic shifts in all operating assumptions of society as we know it. And the third is global resource depletion. In other words, a loss of natural capital to sustain, you know, the psychotic economy that exists right now. And this basically means fresh water, forest, ocean, soil, and wildlife extinctions, and many cross-cutting issues. So the extensive depletion of other key resources basic to the industrial systems as well as to human welfare. These include fresh water, genetic resources, forests, fish and wildlife, fertile soils, coral reefs, and most elements of the local, regional, and global commons. In other words, public places that belong to everybody, including those that cannot speak for themselves. Forests, flora and fauna, biodiversity of many kinds make the survival of humans and other species far more tenuous than that at any other time in human history. And we also face the possible loss of 50% of the world's plant and animal species in the next decades to come. So what does it mean? Well, it means we got to democratize the colonial power system, the energy system. And the U.S. is the wealthiest country in the world, and that prides itself on technological advances, yet can't keep the lights on in New York City. Centralized power production systems based upon the dependency of fossil fuel regimes and nuclear power, decentralized political power, it disconnects communities from control over energy. And this is a huge problem because I think one of the greatest, the very energy grid in the United States of America right now is pushing a system of neo-colonization. Because our Native America is being turned into the energy batteries, whether it's the Four Corners power plant, or whether it's the oil and gas industrial complex on the North Slope of Alaska, or whether it's the hydro dams that were built in my territory. It's all, a form of neo-colonial, neo-colonization that is occurring. So the U.S. are energy junkies. They're total addicts. Energy addiction is a huge issue in this country. Overconsumption, bottom line is Mother Earth cannot meet the demands of our industrialized society. And I did bring some posters too, just so I don't forget. I want to put it out now. I've got some posters. We have an emerging Pull the Plug campaign on October 13th, actually, on I think it's Monday. We're encouraging everybody to power down, to protect Mother Earth, and give Mother Earth a rest. I'll pass out some literature on that for all of you later. Disparities of wealth between rich and poor. You know, this is another issue, you know, that's based in this neo-colonization that I'm talking about. Economic power is translated into political power. This is a very real reality. And we've got to put power back into our communities and into local people. We've got to localize things. Many of you are involved in many strategies to do this very thing. So I want to talk a bit about, you know, the production of oil and gas, which is the primary energy source in our transport-based economy here in the United States, just to give you a little primer on exactly what oil and gas companies do here in America and worldwide. So their goals are basically, here's the sole purpose why oil and gas companies exist. Number one, to explore. Number two, to find reserves. Number three, to produce oil and gas. Number four, to transport fuel to consumers. Number five, to explore to replace depleted reserves. And where do they do this? Well, they go offshore. They go to the Arctic. They go to rainforests and other pristine ecosystems because they've already used up all the other places, you know, where they're in the last 100 years of oil and gas development. And so now they're going to find more reserves in the most pristine of ecosystems left on the planet. And unfortunately, these are the places where indigenous peoples of the world are making their final stand to protect what little land we have left. And, you know, to protect these sacred places where you can still go and drink from the water, where you can still harvest animals and medicines and plants, you know, to subsist in a healthy way. Places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So energy systems. Can everybody see that? This model here, basically, the only thing that you think about when you think about turning lights on, when you think about driving to the supermart or whatever, you're thinking about services rendered, the last two pieces on this thing. But a lot of people don't think about the entire chain of production of energy systems and all of the impacts associated along this chain of production that gets displaced on the backs of poor communities of color and on the backs of indigenous peoples. So energy solutions to what problem? What are people from different segments of society saying when they talk about oil and gas? Well, Joe Public is saying oil is a depletable resource. It's going to run out in 50 years. What's the World Bank saying? Well, they're saying 2 billion people live without electricity. The World Watch Institute is saying the environment is experiencing irreparable harm. The IPCC scientists are saying climate change threatens to deeply disrupt life on the planet. The WTO, World Trade Organization, is saying economic growth is constrained by barriers to energy resource development. Geopolitical and military strategists, i.e. U.S. military industrial complex, oil is the lifeline of industrialization. Our country must have a secure supply. And what are impacted communities and allied campaigners, people like all of you sitting here today? Well, what we're saying is some people are recklessly harming life on the planet and causing others to suffer unjustly. And the last laugh, ladies and gentlemen, well, industrialization is an aberration based on prolific fossil fuel consumption. Bottom line, what booms must bust. Okay? Simple mathematics, really. So what's Joe Public saying? Well, Joe Public's saying, I'm going to pray about the apocalypse and keep on driving. The World Bank is saying, I'm going to finance large power plants for industry and not for rural electrification. The World Watch Institute is saying invest in efficiency and renewable energy technology. The IPCC scientists are saying we need to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions right now. The World Trade Organization, well, their solution is let's eliminate environmental regulations preventing negative technology transfer. What are the geopolitical and military strategists saying? They're saying, well, I know, let's invade territories with large known reserves and hedge our risk by diversifying our sources. Iraq, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Africa, Venezuela, and Iran. Okay. Excuse me, I had something stuck in my throat. And what are impacted communities and allied campaigners saying? Well, we're saying what we've always been saying. We're going to fight for self-determination, energy sovereignty, and the repayment of the ecological debt that has been accumulated through the unsustainable consumption of the capitalist economy. And the last laugh is subsistence. Bottom line is sustainable. And that's it. This map here that I got up on the wall comes from some friends of mine, Project Underground. It's an NGO that has gone underground. They were one of the many victims of the post 9/11 funding world. But this map shows all of the threatened ecosystems and petroleum exploitation that is happening across Mother Earth, just to give you an idea of the global reach of oil and gas corporations. Every line that is dotted out, like striked out like that, are places where oil companies have bought, you know, the rights to drill for oil and gas and to explore for more resources. And, you know, the green and the yellow are you know, forests. The blue is coral reefs, and the orange represents mangrove forests. In other words, the regions of the planet that are the most biodiverse regions. And, you know, just to throw out a statistic for all of you to take home, you know, worldwide there are 350 million indigenous peoples. And those 350 million indigenous peoples represent 86% of all the languages spoke on Mother Earth. Okay? And they're cradled in 80% of the world's last remaining pristine ecosystems, places that are still healthy. And those are all the places that you see up on that map that are stricken out by oil and gas exploration. Okay? And just to give you an idea, because this is the theme of the conference, biodiversity and cultural diversity are inextricably linked. Okay? Healthy ecosystems and the diversity of humankind and all the sacred teachings that come with all those many languages are linked directly to, you know, a healthy and rich ecosystem. I think what's Vinata Shiva, I think, talks about the monoculturing of the world. You know, there's a lot of truth to that. So transportation impacts that come with oil and gas development, I mean, you know, like at the very top of the upstream of oil and gas development, you know, with extraction and exploration, there's all kinds of destruction that happens to primarily indigenous communities and whatnot, you know, that are sacrificed for the benefit of the transportation systems that we all benefit from. But, you know, once they actually get the oil out of the ground and destroy ecosystems and ruin lives and cultures, you know, there's also impacts that come when they just transport it. And those impacts are pipeline corridors that fracture forests and you know, bring in more development, whether it's mining or forestry. Because oil and gas companies are the richest companies on the planet. Okay, they got GDPs bigger than the state of California. Okay, and so they got the money to go in the hardest to reach places. And so always behind the oil companies come the mining companies. Always behind the mining companies come the forestry companies, and so on and so forth, or together. It's just a whole destructive cycle. But the transport impacts that come with it are pipeline corridors, oil spills, militarization of transport zones. Okay, so you know, which means people getting disconnected and displaced from their land and not able to access traditional hunting and gathering territories. And there's also a trail of Superfund and sacrifice zones that come with the transport of oil and gas. You know, and by sacrifice zones, you know, I mean places that were sacrificed, you know, and communities that were sacrificed, their environmental and ecological health for another more privileged population. Refining impacts, when they actually refine the raw product into things that they can sell on the market, well, you have stack emissions, spent chemical catalysts, you know, all kinds of volatile organic compounds like benzene and all kinds of things that are nasty and that come with the refining process. You've got explosions, fires, spills, which are all called accidental releases. And you've got public health epidemics like the Cancer Alley in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Many of you might remember the Staten Island refinery explosion back in February. And so, you know, and of course, who lives beside these oil refineries? It's not rich white communities in America. No, it's poor communities of color. It's Latino, Asian, and Black African American communities, you know, that live by oil refineries And so you have a whole environmental justice issue just right there. And then you've got retail and end-use impacts too that come with, you know, the oil and gas transportation off-ramp economy of America. You've got underground storage tank leaks. You've got vapor leaks from gas tanks. You've got the emissions of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur oxides, nitrous oxides, volatile organic compounds, and all kinds of little mini particulates that love to get into children's lungs and cause asthma, all coming from people connecting with Mother Earth by driving over her with their SUV. Okay? And all of this cheaper for a price than bottled water. Of course, right now, you know, the price of oil has been falsely ballooned up to what, 80-something a barrel, which is its own conspiracy, but we won't get into that. But basically, you know, typically a barrel of oil, you know, on the global market, you know, up until a couple of years ago was $30, and cost of oil. With all the destruction and all the devastation, the human and ecological health consequences that come with just this one form of energy development, you know, what is the real cost of oil? Well, it certainly isn't $30 a barrel. I mean, because how can you put a price on human lives, let alone the lives of all the life that exists within biodiversity that is, you know, totally destroyed, you know, as a result of this economy? To give you an idea of where does a barrel of oil go? Well, approximately 19.5 gallons goes towards gasoline, 9.2 gallons goes to fuel oil, jet fuel represents 4.1 gallons, asphalt, what our roads are made of, represents 2.3 gallons, kerosene 0.2 gallons, lubricants 0.5 gallons, and then petrochemical and other products 6.2 gallons. And by petrochemical products, we're talking about fertilizers, because of course our entire food production system is based on petrochemical fertilizers. You know, all generated through complements of the oil and gas economy, you know, and also the pharmaceutical industry. A big component of that is represented as well, too, by petrochemical process. And over 90% of this, though, is all going to transportation. You know, a relatively small percent goes to lubricants and agricorp industries and that, but 90% goes to transportation fuels in the U.S., and they're all petroleum-based. And so here's the chain of production. You've got the place where they're taking it out of the ground. You've got the refinery, pipelines, city terminal, and then finally in your car. And all along the way, you have economic and environmental destruction imposed on predominantly communities of color and indigenous communities that are just trying to, you know, live their life. So you've got frontline communities that are impacted by the extraction of oil and gas. You've got fence line communities of color that are impacted by the refineries. You've got pipeline communities that are impacted by the pipelines. And all of them and everything that they're going through is directly controlled and tied by demand, by the consumer communities, okay, by the market. Are we running out of oil? Oil scarcity is dependent on price, which is dependent on demand, control of supply, and geopolitical conflicts. So the higher the profit margin, the greater the cost justification for new exploration, and the larger the proved reserves. Running out of oil is probably the weakest reason for making the transition away from oil. From an environmental perspective, we cannot afford to burn all the proven reserves of oil we already know exist today. So why the heck are we looking for more? Militarization of oil-producing areas, expensive and deadly oil wars, environmental protection, and climate justice are all more relevant and compelling reasons to move off of oil and other fossil fuels as well, you know, like coal. So let's look to the future. The world is not running out of energy. It's very likely, though, running out of cheap oil, natural capital to sustain industrialization, environmental stability in places to put the waste that's created through this off-ramp economy, and time for a smooth transition to a better energy base. We're running out of time. You know, bottom line, the oil economy is unsustainable. This sign is a picture I took up in Aneth. Compliments of Mobil, Exxon. Our children are our future. So are energy consumption levels amongst industrialized nations sustainable? Heck no. Industrialized societies are living outside the present and local ecological boundaries. And what they're accumulating by doing that is a thing called ecological debt. Does anybody in here know what that is? Can I hear a couple? Anybody else? Using we're borrowing from our children's future to sustain what we're doing today, for sure. Extracting more than can be replenished. Okay, so taking something you can't pay for over here. Sorry? Destroying our own life today. Undermining our ability to survive as a race of the planet. Definitely these are all components to ecological debt. And what it comes down to simplistically is we're borrowing from the past and the future to live in the present. Instead of learning from our past, preparing in the present to defend our future. Okay? And it's absolutely crazy. Definitely, it's not just Indigenous peoples though. It's everybody. You know, it's all your children. I mean, we're basically, you know, we're living off our children's lives right now, our children's lives. So, bottom line, what is fossil fuel economy inextricably linked to? Well, it's inextricably linked to climate change. And you know, I mean, you know, let's hear it for Al Gore for winning the Nobel Peace Prize for the work that he's doing. For sure. You know, I appreciate, you know, people like Al Gore because, you know, he plays an important role in terms of recruiting an army of soccer moms and NASCAR dads from Middle America. But the one thing, no, it's true, and they vote and they have money, you know, and with economic power comes political power. I mean, that's how it works in America, so it's a good thing. But you know, aside from the mainstream, you know, and what Inconvenient Truth is talking about in terms of the raw data and the science, there's a whole social justice analysis that people need to understand about climate change. And the fact that climate change disproportionately impacts poor southern countries and predominantly communities of color and Indigenous communities here in North America a heck of a lot more than it impacts people who can call up Allstate and 50-50 get their house, you know, insured again, you know what I mean, after Hurricane Katrina or whatever. Bottom line, there are communities that are more susceptible to violent, unpredictable weather events associated to our destabilized climate, you know, as a result of the fossil fuel economy and man-made CO2 than others. And so there's a whole climate justice movement that has emerged in the last decade to really try and push home some more understanding, and this is the second component to what I wanted to talk to you all about before I get into the connection to food security and food sovereignty. How am I doing on time? Can I just do a time check?
You've got about 25 minutes.
Great, good, perfect. So, just climate policies reduce CO2 emissions and stabilize atmospheric CO2 concentrations immediately and with aggressive targets. Okay, we got to stop cooking the planet. Just climate policies promote and develop renewable energy and other alternatives. We need immediate cuts and targets that are extremely aggressive, and there is a question of how to wean America from being energy junkies or energy addicts. Bottom line, though, there's no consensus on what to do. There's so many different camps, whether it's environmentalists or whether it's the policymakers or whether it's community activists. You know, nobody can really agree on what kind of CO2 cutbacks we need, although there are some pretty stark realities emerging from the science community about, you know, how aggressive, you know, we've got to get in terms of our cutbacks. But, you know, I've heard 15 to 30% by 2020, 50 to 90% by 2050. IEN and others in our network, you know, are saying zero CO2 emissions by 2050, just to be able to, like, to avoid the most catastrophic of impacts associated to our climate changing. Global emissions, trading regimes beyond Kyoto have their own thing that they're talking about around emissions trading. Here in the United States, we're talking about CAFE standards, which are fuel efficiency standards, and biofuels as a solution. States and cities have their own thing that they're doing as a solution. The mayors have their own mayor's Kyoto protocol that they're pushing forward, and they're really pushing the whole natural gas economy that is burgeoning here in the United States. And local, I mean, we're all implementing a lot more simplistic solutions, whether it's composting or turning off the lights, flicking off, and and all sorts of different things. Taking a cold shower, hey, just kidding. But there's a huge debate right now, and this is why I'm talking about when I say that there's a significant lack of analysis that exists right now in the emerging trading regimes like Kyoto that are proposing to commodify the Earth's atmosphere and trade it in a man-made market. Okay, cap and trade, cap and tax, cap and auction, levels of carbon reduction, all of these things are being debated within the environmental community, within the governments of the world, and there's significant issues, I think, with each one of these realities. So the last couple slides were part of the first principle of 10 climate policies that I want to share with you, and the second is protect and empower vulnerable communities and individuals. Climate change affects Indigenous peoples, people of color, and low-income communities in 4 critical ways. It compromises health, socially, culturally, and economic. There are major disruptions that occur. It imposes financial burdens. It violates tribal treaty rights. And compounding changes, or the cumulative impacts that come with the changing climates that can be directly associated to food production systems, our ability to subsist off the land, changing migration patterns of animals that our northern tribes subsist off. The list goes on and on and on of the cumulative impacts that are associated to climate change, which are tied directly, and then many of our communities are hit twice as hard because they're also hit by the cause of climate change, unsustainable oil and gas development. So they're hit twice as hard. And this is the disproportionate burden that I'm talking about. So air pollution, which is associated to the fossil fuel economy as well, already hits people of color especially hard. Over 57% of whites, 65% of African Americans, and 80% of Latinos live in 437 counties with substandard air quality in this country. Indigenous peoples in North Dakota, Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, and the North Slope region of Alaska all have high levels of respiratory illnesses. And these are in areas of the fossil fuel regime: coal-fired power plants, oil and gas drilling and extraction, refineries, coal mining, and coal bed methane. All can be directly linked to these respiratory illnesses that are associated to the fossil fuel regime and climate change, and they're compounded by climate change. This is a picture of a flaring tower in Prudhoe Bay. These things burn 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. They're not supposed to, but they do. In the community of Barrow, which is on the north slope of Alaska, they are surrounded by an industrial complex of pipelines and oil pump jacks the size of Rhode Island. And that industrial complex emits more pollution, in the form of NOx and SOx and other pollution than the entire Washington, D.C. metro. And the village of Barrow is comprised of 400 people, and 40 of those people have rare forms of cancer. Do the math on that. This is a picture of the proposed Mackenzie Valley gas pipeline that Imperial Oil is the leader of the oil consortium that's trying to build this 1,700-kilometer pipeline to get natural gas down from the north slope of Canada down to the tar sands development. This is a picture of the Mackenzie River Delta. They want to strip mine a bunch of coal out of the delta because they need coal to produce steel. They want to produce a steel plant so they can build the pipeline right up there. So, and then they're going to have energy stations, energy power plants to power the whole thing. It's not just a pipeline. It's a whole industrial complex that's going to, have all kinds of impacts and destroy this intact and pristine ecosystem. which, by the way, the Dene people have used for time immemorial. This is a picture of some of our allied campaigners and community activists during the Commission on Climate Change and the first member of the party meetings in Montreal 2 years ago. This is a picture of the biggest development on the planet now, the tar sands development in northern Alberta, Canada. To give you an idea, this is a picture from outer space of some of the waste ponds that have been created through the separation of the oil from the soil. They use approximately 1.6 billion gallons of pristine water every year for this tar sands, and they're proposing right now a $25 billion expansion of this project, and it's spread out over literally thousands of kilometers of traditional land use areas of the Dene, Cree, and Métis Indigenous communities that call that area home in northern Alberta. All that oil is proposed to be, from the tar sands, is proposed to be piped directly to a proposed oil refinery that IEN has been fighting to put a stop to in the Fort Berthold 3 affiliated tribes community in North Dakota. Okay? This is a picture from an oil and gas, Exxon oil and gas pump jack in Aneth, up in Utah in the part of the Navajo Nation. This is an open waste pond. These are supposed to be covered because birds get into there and they die. Okay, this is not a good thing. It's a picture that I took when I was visiting Aneth. Proud to be part of the Navajo Nation. ExxonMobil. This is how proud they are. They're so proud to be a part of the Navajo Nation that they build one of their flaring towers right over the traditional hogan of a community. These people raise their sheep right beside this flaring tower. You can't see the fire because it's daytime, but there's a 30-foot column that's burning 24 hours a day, 365 days a year over this traditional Navajo home. So this is what a waste pond should look like. It's supposed to have a cover over it, okay? And this is a picture, of course, many of you are familiar with the battle against Peabody Coal Mining Corporation, in the Navajo Nation. This is a picture of my good friend Lillian and my friend Roberto. And they're looking at one of the Kayenta mine operations to strip mine coal out of this beautiful territory. A safe mine is a clean mine. Black Mesa mine. Yeah, right. I think this is the Mojave Generating Station. Just to give you all some images. And this is a picture of the Dota Desert Rock protest. People standing up right now as we speak to fight to protect the sacredness of the Four Corners region from a coal-fired power plant. It's a picture of their occupation site. People of color are almost 3 times more likely than whites to be hospitalized or die from asthma and other respiratory illnesses. As climate change brings about warmer weather, it will make the illnesses associated with air pollution a hell of a lot worse. Asthma, bronchitis, lung inflammation, severe coughing, shortness of breath, and painful breathing. Hey. This is a picture from Canada's Cancer Alley in the Sarnia district, southern Ontario. Within the Chippewas of Sarnia, within 10 kilometers of their community, there are over 30 coal-fired power plants, oil refineries, petrochemical plants, and fertilizer plants within 10 kilometers. Okay? That's about 6 miles, just to give you an idea of what they're living with. This picture here is actually where their tribal council office is. It's right beside an oil refinery. So climate change is expected to increase the number of heat deaths nationally by 90 to 540%. People of color are 2 times more likely than whites to die in a heat wave. Indigenous peoples in the Arctic region are experiencing shorter winters and warmer climate, which are disrupting their subsistence, culture, and lifestyles. In the Arctic and the Pacific, a rising sea level is forcing several communities on the coast and islands to abandon their homes and the traditional lands, creating legal and political complications. Talking about the first environmental refugees as a result of climate change. It's going to get a heck of a lot worse, ladies and gentlemen. In the southwest here, drought is affecting the area's already limited water resources, causing livestock, crops, and traditional medicines to die, and also including water wars, emerging water wars. And furthermore, many Indigenous communities are already suffering effects of unsustainable natural resource development, oil spills, strip mining, contamination of water resources, like for example over by Crown Point with the Nsutu uranium mine they're proposing. I mean, why are you going to inject something into the earth that's going to melt uranium and then suck it out with a straw and contaminate the aquifer when there's no surface water. Like, it's totally crazy. So, you know, anyway, don't get me started. You know, desecration of land, sacred sites, and assaults on tribal sovereignty all can be associated to the fossil fuel economy and the energy economy of America, and of course to climate change. And global warming will increase the number of flood, drought, and fire occurrences worldwide. And low-income people do not have the ability to move after events like these. Furthermore, low-income people typically lack the insurance to replace their possessions that have been lost. Katrina, Southwest tribes, Alaska, you know, a lot of these places are not going to be able to recover from violent and unpredictable weather events associated to our changing climate. And climate change will reduce the discretionary spending too, because prices will rise across the board. Low-income families will have to spend even more on food and electricity, which already represent a huge proportion of their budget. We need to protect and empower vulnerable individuals and communities. Just climate policies must be preventative and not reactionary. They must aim to prevent communities from facing losses rather than simply compensating people for them. We must build capacity. They must build capacity in communities to adapt to climate change impacts. Tribal adaptation planning resources must be made available for tribes. They need to be designed in a way that does not further burden low-income people of color and Indigenous communities who are already in a state of shock. We need to ensure as well a just transition for workers and communities. Certain industries and workers will be strongly affected by the impacts of climate change, fossil fuel regime shifts, and energy and climate policies. Certain energy resource tribes will be economically affected by the energy transition to a low-carbon energy economy. I mean, the Navajo Nation is definitely one of them, you know. And there's so many of our native families, you know, whether it's up in Alaska, in the Navajo Nation, where I come from, where they're, you know, proposing to build some new dams, where there are economic issues, you know, and in communities that are economically dependent on these unsustainable economies. And so these corporations that have destroyed our homelands for economic gains, in my opinion, are on the hook financially to retrain these workers into green jobs, into sustainable jobs, you know, and to ensure a just transition, you know, from the fossil fuel economy. And that's what just transition means. Just climate policies, you know, must engage and empower communities with the information and resources to transition to renewable resource economy. Transparency, information, technological transfer, and funding mechanisms all must be a part of that. We need to compensate workers and communities for lost jobs and other negative economic effects and create economic opportunities with the emerging, you know, low-carbon economy, low-carbon revolution. Fund programs using the polluter pays principle. Ensure cleanup and remediation of closed facilities. These are all parts of shutdown plans that companies must implement, you know, when they leave our territories. And all of this has got to require community participation. Environmental justice means the fair treatment of people of all races and economic groups in the implementation and enforcement of environmental protection laws. And that's straight from the U.S. EJ Executive Order. And climate change policies have the potential for allowing inequities to continue. So, just climate policies also represent the fact that we speak as communities of color, as Indigenous communities, we speak for ourselves. You know, we don't need people to speak for us. You know, we speak for ourselves, and this includes marginalized and disenfranchised communities in the climate policy process. We need to level the playing field. In other words, providing resources for Indigenous and people of color communities to engage at all levels of policy making. We need to link climate and energy impacts on the front line and on the fence line to the policymakers. Because right now, the people that are speaking on our behalf, representing the upper echelons of the ENGO world and the policy world, are totally disconnected from what's going on, you know, here in the Southwest. They don't know. They don't know, and nor do they have the cosmological or world view or that sacred relationship or understanding of that to be able to come from that perspective when they speak on our behalf. So we need to get our people up to those tables. Tribal sovereignty. American Indian tribal governments have a special, unique, and legal and political relationship with the government of the United States, defined by history, treaties, statutes, court decisions, and the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. has entered into more than 600 treaties and agreements with American Indian tribes. And these treaties and agreements create a variety of legal responsibilities by the U.S., our indigenous tribes, and provide the basis for a government-to-government relationship. Okay? I just want to put that out there too. Global problems need global solutions. No nation working alone can stop climate change. And we need to ensure global accountability. We need to strengthen civil society participation in global meetings on climate, NGOs, grassroots, indigenous peoples organizations. We need to demand equity between Annex I countries and developed countries. We need to have legally binding targets. None of this voluntary BS, okay? We need legally binding targets in the climate change debates, so that our communities can be protected. Because the voluntary mechanisms that currently exist in the market-based approaches that are being implemented through trading regimes, have serious human rights implications, not just for communities of colors here in America, in Canada, and other industrialized nations, but also for the global South. Okay, there are serious concerns in the shoddy science that is being put forward, How's my time?
Oh, you've got about 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get into a bit of this. I just want to, let me just quickly, I just want to, so, the U.S. has got to lead this process. How many of you heard the hype, China just overtook the United States in emissions? How many of you heard that? And there's all this rhetoric about, oh, China, right? Well, yes, it's true. China overtook the United States this year as being the primary emitter of CO2 on Earth. However, if you look at the cumulative burning of fossil fuels over the history of the use of fossil fuels and industrialization, China is nowhere near the total CO2 contribution that the United States has made to the atmosphere. They're nowhere near, okay? And so it's a lot of rhetoric, and don't get caught up in the hype, okay? I mean, yes, China's got to play a strong leadership role in it, but they should not be scapegoated as a way for the United States to say, we're not that bad, okay? So don't get caught up in that hype. Google it, do your research on it. It's a lot of hype, okay? And it's being pushed by conservative hawks. So the U.S. must lead just climate policies, recognize that developed countries owe a debt to developing countries, provide developing countries with funding mechanisms for clean, renewable energy and sustainable development. We got to demand that the U.S. take lead in aggressively reducing carbon and other GHG emissions. And we have to stop exploration for fossil fuels. The impacts of our dependence on fossil fuels extends way beyond climate change. Just policies, will eliminate fossil fuel exploration and development, eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels, and give subsidies to the research and development of renewable energy. I mean, I was always blown away by just some of the statistics I've heard. If in terms of how quick we could turn this country over to renewable energy if we just stopped giving these big multinational corporations bazillions of dollars, and invested that into research and development. We need to invest in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and we need to eliminate the impact of fossil fuels on impacted communities. This is a picture, a big wind turbine at a powwow over, I believe, in the Sioux Reservation. It's just kind of inspiring. You see it? Yeah? Okay. So native wind, make wind, not war. The Indian tribes of North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska are collaborating on an unprecedented project to develop the massive wind resources of the northern Great Plains. Some estimates say there are potentially 60 gigawatts of wind power in the upper prairie lands. I've heard others call it the Saudi Arabia of wind power. Native energy sovereignty. 8 separate tribes are all moving ahead with plans to develop the first large-scale indigenous owned and operated wind farm in the country. And the short-term goal is 80 megawatts of wind-produced electricity. Native energy justice. Wind power on indigenous lands provides future tribal economic, cultural, and community sustainability, and capacity building based upon renewable energy generation of clean power to transition away from the burning of lignite coal, the most CO2 intensive source of electricity in the United States. Okay? So I'm running out of time here, and there's quite a bit more here.
5 minutes.
5 minutes? So I guess really, just going back to the carbon trading market, the carbon trading regimes that are emerging, how many of you have heard about market-based approaches to mitigating climate change? How many of you heard of Kyoto? Yeah? Good. Well, Kyoto, all it is it's a new trading regime, okay? It's the commodification of the atmosphere of Mother Earth, okay? And they're trading CO2, basically, okay? They've commodified it. But the implications on a human rights level of that are severe. And, the science behind carbon sequestration, okay, like injecting CO2 back into the earth, the whole basis behind clean coal technologies, there isn't any real science yet that can prove that that even is sustainable or that it works. I mean, there's some various small pilot projects, I believe, in the North Sea by Norway, where they've stored CO2 deep under the ocean to test how volatile it is and how sustainable it is, but they ain't going to have the data from that for another decade. But yet the U.S. is banking on that and saying, yeah, let's do it, and it's BS science, Carbon trading shifts away the responsibility to act from those who have contributed the most to climate change, to the climate problem, to those who have contributed the least. Carbon stored above ground is not the same as carbon stored in fossil fuels. This is a really important fact for all of you to know, so you don't get caught up in the hype. Confusing fossil carbon with biological carbon results in sinks, and all sinks are our forests and other places where carbon is stored organically, places like the Amazon rainforest, the boreal forest in Canada, temperate coastal rainforests. But basically, confusing fossil carbon with biological carbon results in sinks being phantom reductions, which do not actually address the problem of climate change. Because fossil fuel carbon is stored, through millennia, and it took millennia, millions of years for it to be there, and it's permanent, okay? But organic materials die after a couple hundred years to half a millennium. So the adoption of domestic and international mechanisms that allow for carbon trading has turned the potential threat of climate change into an opportunity for profit. And the trading of carbon and greenhouse gases is a new form of colonialism. It creates CO2 colonialism. And there's also a property issue that comes with it. And history has seen attempts to commodify land, food, labor, forest, water, our very genetics and ideas. And carbon trading follows in the footsteps of this history and turns the Earth's carbon cycling capacity into property that can be bought and sold in the global man-made market. Trading mechanisms are being implemented, and we need to closely monitor these carbon markets. We need to ensure carbon sinks are controlled by the relevant communities and that they're effective. We need to include impacted communities in the development and operation of these carbon markets, and we need to provide the revenues to those impacted communities. It cannot be another way to concentrate wealth in the pockets of the few, and and a way to keep down the poor. And so, with that, I'm just gonna leave it at that. But part of the one point that I wanted to end with today is to talk a bit about one of the emerging markets that are definitely directly linked to carbon trading and carbon defense mechanisms. Okay, and that's the emerging biofuels market. And the biofuels industry is I'm a staunch advocate and supporter of taking biofuels back to what they were originally meant to be. I think the first diesel engine was created by some German guy during World War II, and it was because he couldn't get any fossil fuels to run his farm. So he created this diesel engine, that ran on peanut oil or something, and it was local produced fuel on a sustainable level, so that he could farm his land. Okay, and I'm all for that. So I'm all for local biofuels like biodiesel and all of that. on a sustainable level. But when we get the big agricore companies, the Cargills and the Monsantos of the world, involved in energy production and transportation, these companies are stepping up now, and they have powerful forces in the Beltway that are lobbying, for this. How many of you heard of the farm subsidies bill? This is psychotic, what is happening. And I think that, many of you have probably heard of the first direct impacts that are coming with the emerging biofuels market in terms of how it's going to impact our ability to feed our people. You look at Mexico, where the price of tortilla has ballooned from $1 a bag to $5 a bag, because corn producers get more money selling their corn to the biofuels markets to prop up the U.S. fossil fuel economy. Okay? And the same thing can be said about Indonesia. If you go to Indonesia, vast tracts of prehistoric peat moss forests and mangrove forests are being wiped out through slash and burn, which is actually generating more CO2 than they'd save, okay, so that they can plant palm oil seeds to prop up the European Union's biofuels emerging industry, okay? And so you have this direct fight, okay, and this direct system that's being created through the emerging trading regimes and the emerging capital that's being created through these trading regimes to invest in these carbon defense mechanisms in the global south. So again, you have people in the global south sacrificing their lands so that people in the industrialized north can continue to practice their unsustainable lifestyles. Because whether it's palm oil plantations in Indonesia, or whether it's switchgrass or sugar cane plantations in Brazil and beyond, or whether it's, I don't know what they're growing in Africa, but, or whether it's Middleland America and Nebraska, with corn. We have to take a serious look at the realities that, biofuels on an industrial level is not a solution to climate change. It's a lot of hype. And I mean, bottom line, we've got to stop burning, period. Zero emissions, okay? And the technology's there. Because if we don't, put a stop to the business as usual that has been allowed to happen, it's going to have major implications on the ability for Indigenous peoples to subsist, and to practice our traditional lifestyles, and to continue to harvest our medicines, and to continue to pick our berries and wild rice, and all of the other beautiful and sacred things that our people have lived on for time immemorial. I mean, one only has to travel down that river of destruction that I showed you today here on this PowerPoint presentation, from the North Slope of Alaska all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, to see the impacts on our food production systems already that have been, created through the fossil fuel economy, and doubly compounded by the emerging climate change crisis. And so, with that, I would say that we all have a sacred responsibility to fight to promote that space, to be allowed to talk about these topics of food security, food sovereignty, to talk about challenging the fossil fuel regime, to talk about getting involved in the fight for climate justice, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about reevaluating our relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth, because that's really what it's all about, okay? So I want to thank you in a good way from my heart for inviting me here today to share a little bit about the work I'm involved in and where I come from. When I go home, I will tell my people that I was well taken care of by the Tesuque people, and and definitely I enjoyed the blue corn the best. That was the best drink ever. That was really, really good. So thank you so much for the people that cooked the breakfast this morning too. And you go see it.